slides?
No, but you should be able to share your screen from the share screen button below. There you
go.
All right, so you can see something there that looks like a slide. Okay, great.
You're on. Good.
Okay, very good. I've got to turn off some sound here. I'm going to talk about the future of air pollution in Utah. But before I do, I just wanted to say that I'm a person who doesn't reveal his political bias until I open my mouth. A couple of days ago, I had a birthday, and I asked my family, I said I didn't want much for my birthday, just two small things. The first was, let me get, the first was, I wanted the entire Trump family in jail. The second was I wanted a functional democracy. I thought that really wasn't too much to ask. And then I started thinking, well, how about throw in a livable climate? And then I started thinking, well, maybe fourth on my list was having Tucker Carlson be forced to come mow my lawn. And then maybe fifth might be Mitch McConnell having some gigantic kidney stones. And maybe sixth, having the Democrats grow a spine. And then maybe Rupert Murdoch having his diapers changed in a nursing home run by Maxine Waters. And then someone teaching Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene how to read. And then how about OIC as president? And maybe making Ted Cruz mute. And then let's talk about the Supreme Court. So I don't want much, but unfortunately, I didn't get any of that yet. So you're going to have to help me out in terms of birthday presents. Now, having politicized this issue, I'm going to try and depoliticize this issue because far too many issues surrounding public health have become deeply politicized and they shouldn't be. If you remember any vision or picture of anything I show today, I want you to remember this picture because air pollution is very analogous to all the health problems we know are associated with smoking cigarettes. And when the air is really bad, it's more like this. Of course, this is a well-known BYU fraternity stunt. More specifically, the same diseases we know are related to smoking are related to air pollution exposure. That includes multiple attacks on the heart attacks, heart failure, heart arrhythmias, cardiovascular disease, the development of atherosclerosis, strokes, acceleration of the aging process, sudden death, cancers, brain diseases, cognitive loss, behavioral disorders, even crime, all types of lung diseases, impaired fetal development, poor pregnancy outcomes, endocrine disorders, even like type 2 diabetes. Now, several years ago, when we started going public with our message, we started quoting what we thought was an estimate based on the literature that there were 1,000 to 2,000 deaths annually in Utah because of our air pollution. Recently, however, a study from experts here in Utah updated that. And they estimate now that there are between 2,500 and 8,000 deaths annually in Utah because of our air pollution, even despite the fact that in some ways our air pollution has gotten better, not in all ways, however. And that the average person loses about 1.1 to maybe 3.6 years of their life. Some people maybe as much as 5 years. Now, I want to talk about a few concepts about air pollution that are not often talked about in the media. The first is that there is no safe air level of air pollution. This is a graph published by some of the world's most well-respected researchers, where on the horizontal axis, going to your right, you can see increasing doses of three types of pollution. The first is cigarette smoke, the second is secondhand cigarette smoke, and the third is community air pollution. And on the vertical axis is the signature outcome of an air pollution exposure, which is sudden death. What you can see there is as soon as you get any air pollution at all, we are seeing statistical bumps in the number of sudden deaths in a community. Now that's analogous to studies that show, in fact, smoking one cigarette a day is nearly half as much risk as smoking an entire pack. That is reflected in the first part of this graph, which we would say is a hyperbolic graph because of this relationship. So looking at this part of the graph right at the beginning where that red circle is, that is the steepest part of the relationship between air pollution and death. Meaning if you increase air pollution just a little bit, you're actually having more of an impact when the baseline level is pretty clean than you are further out like this. So you can see once we're out at higher levels of air pollution or more cigarette smoking, we don't see anywhere near as much bump up in the outcome where those orange arrows are than we did when the air was much cleaner, where the green arrows are. So if you tell a legislator this, they'll interpret this as, oh, that means that it really doesn't matter that much when our air is terrible, we can make it even worse. But the real message is all air pollution matters, and there is no safe level of air pollution, and we should be doing everything we can to clean it up. The third concept is there's no even short-term air pollution exposure matters. Even air pollution that's only as brief as a few hours in some cases or a few days. In fact, number 4, the air pollution you breathed in January can still be inside your body in April, still causing disease and inflammation. And that relates to the 5th concept, which is some particles you never get rid of. On my left is a pink lung at autopsy from a non-smoker, healthy individual who lived his entire life in rural Australia. On the other side is also a non-smoker, but a city dweller from Sydney, Australia. And you can see that gray, black speckled lung from a non-smoker who lived his entire life in a city with less air pollution than Salt Lake City. Unfortunately, when most of us get to the point of an autopsy, our lungs are going to look much like that. The sixth concept is that there are, in fact, multiple routes of exposure. You don't have to actually use your lungs to be affected by air pollution. Air pollution can actually attach itself to the mucosal lining of your nose and then attach itself to the nerves in your nose. And then as a conveyor belt works, can migrate right back to your brainstem and penetrate inside your brain. Your skin can also be a source of absorption of air pollution. And that was illustrated by one of my favorite studies. Researchers wanted to know how much polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon exposure a person might get by going to a barbecue. Now, PAHs, or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, are compounds with multiple benzene rings. They're very toxic. Well, researchers wanted to know what would be the worst or the greatest source of exposure from a barbecue. Well, the number one exposure was the blackened food that people put on a barbecue. Everything that's black has polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. But the next most important source of exposure was actually through skin absorption. And their clothes became saturated such that the researchers actually recommended there was so much absorption of these toxic chemicals from saturated clothes that they recommended when people go home from a barbecue, they actually should change their clothes so their skin doesn't continue to absorb these toxic chemicals. And the moral to this story is never go to a barbecue naked. That's actually one of many morals. Don't go to a barbecue at all, actually, if you don't want to get exposed to PAHs. The 7th concept is that it's not just winter inversions that are a problem. Because air pollution is a problem at any level, it's far more than just an issue for winter inversions. Again, think of that graph that I showed you a minute ago and that curve. Even low doses of air pollution have significant health consequences, and per unit of exposure, it's even worse when the levels are low. The other reason why it's not just a winter inversion situation is because as the summer heats up, ozone is created in the atmosphere by precursors, and that chemical reaction is catalyzed by heat. The EPA's standard for, quote, a supposed safe level of ozone is 70 parts per billion. But now I wanted to introduce you to a study that's about a year and a half old now, where researchers followed people for 18 years throughout the country, and they found that just 3 parts per billion ozone exposure over 10 years caused as much lung damage and loss of lung tissue and impairment of lung function that you would expect from a pack a day smoking of 29 years. The 8th concept is timing is critical. If you're a fetus developing in your mother's womb, then just a weekend of exposure to air pollution can have significant lifelong consequences to the integrity of the development of your organs. Likewise, if you're on the other end of the age spectrum and you're on the verge of a heart attack or stroke, very brief exposures to air pollution, even a matter of hours, can tip you over the edge, causing a stroke or a heart attack, even sudden death. The 9th concept is, as I showed you those lung pictures, pollution particles end up embedded inside all of our critical organs, inside the brain, inside the heart, and in the case of a pregnant mother, inside the placenta. So we are actually allowing newborns to emerge from their mother's womb already pre-polluted. This is undoubtedly one of the reasons why this headline from CNN of a few years ago, exposure to air pollution before birth may shorten our lives. And that is in fact true. And one of the reasons why is because these pollution particles can actually pass through the umbilical cord and interfere with fetal development. In fact, it's even worse than that, because we now know that preconception exposure to chronic air pollution can cause chronic disease. So those adults who have yet to have children are actually impacting the health of the children they might have in the future by the air pollution they're breathing now. Multiple generations can be harmed by a single exposure, illustrated by this fact. A pregnant mother that breathes air pollution will affect her own health, of course. As I just stated, it will affect the health of the fetus. But if the fetus is female, her eggs are also developing in utero. So one exposure can harm 3 separate generations of individuals. And in fact, studies in invertebrates suggest that it may be as many as 11 generations can be impacted by one exposure. So what will the future of air pollution be here in Salt Lake City? Now look at this picture here for a second, and look at this picture for a second, and think to yourself, one of these pictures is from a dystopian sci-fi movie. The other is real and was taken last fall. That one or this one? That one was the first one I showed you was taken from the sci-fi movie Blade Runner in 2049. The other picture was taken from San Francisco, September 2020. And obviously because of these massive wildfires that most of you already are familiar with, and that undoubtedly will occur again this year and are already starting. So let's talk about what will impact our air quality going forward. First and foremost will be the inland port, an area of 25 square miles, essentially a junior Salt Lake City. From that, we expect millions of new containers to be transferred to Salt Lake City per year, dozens of double-stacked trains every single day. We estimate 70,000 more trucks on our roads every day, 150,000 more vehicles every day, more congested and dangerous freeways, obviously, and pressure to double stack I-15. This will, if the satellite port version of that whole project opens up, it will open the floodgates for the extraction industries, coal, oil shale, gas, and tar sands. Researchers are trying to determine how much air pollution is generated by inland ports made this statement. The air quality impacts of ports are significant, and particularly large emissions of diesel exhaust, particulate matter, and nitrogen oxides. Rail on highway diesel trucks and operations at the airport are already responsible for about 1/5 of the air pollution along the Wasatch Front. Furthermore, the inland port pollution will not disperse equally throughout the airshed. We know that much of it will concentrate near its sources. That means communities that are already suffering from from environmental injustice will be further impacted by the inland port. So communities that are already exposed to emissions from the refineries, from other industrial sources, from the airport, from Kennecott, will be impacted all the more. And here's a study that shows people near freeways are exposed to as much as 30 times the concentration of dangerous air pollution particles as those who are as little as a few hundred yards away. So again, all this traffic that will be generated by the inland port will again concentrate in a community that's already significantly disadvantaged. How much air traffic pollution will be generated by the port is difficult to estimate at this point, but one study of airport pollution found that with regard to the Los Angeles airport, the airport generated half as much pollution as all the cars on all their freeways. So another source of pollution for the entire community, but especially for those on the west side. And then we have these massive diesel switcher engines that'll take these containers from trucks to trains and back and forth. And one of these engines can produce as much pollution as maybe between 10,000 and 20,000 cars. Plus, the inland port will take at least 20 years or more to construct. And if you go out there now, you see these massive clouds of construction dust, which if it continues will go on for another 20 years or more. So basically, the inland port is creating a sacrifice zone where maybe as many as 250 to 270,000 people will be experiencing the brunt of most of this new air pollution. Now, you know that the wind can create some real environmental disasters. Here's one of them. Well, here's another one. This is the wind blowing up dust in the dried up Owens Lake in Owens Valley, California. It has become one of the largest single sources of air pollution in the United States. And yet what's happening now is that we're drying up the Great Salt Lake for multiple reasons, climate among them, diversion of the inlets to the Great Salt Lake or other reasons. But if we allow the Great Salt Lake to dry up even more, we are going to turn this situation that you're seeing here in Owens Valley into one almost identical or perhaps even worse in the Salt Lake Valley. And in fact, this story was played out on multiple media outlets in the last week, in the Salt Lake Tribune, the Associated Press, and even internationally, that the drying of the Great Salt Lake is putting our air quality at risk as we near historic lows. And in fact, you can now almost walk all the way to Antelope Island. So the inland port is basically a gateway to turning Salt Lake City in 2040 into Pittsburgh of 1940. Hardly the economic future that any of us want. We're going to see massive climate fires, perhaps even worse than what we've seen the last few years. Researchers have now concluded that wildfires are the biggest source of pollution in California all year round, more than all the cars and all their freeways. We're going to have higher levels of ozone because ozone is an atmospheric reaction catalyzed by the by the combination of VOCs and nitrogen oxides catalyzed by heat. So the hotter the temperatures get, the more ozone will be formed. Now, we would all like Salt Lake City's air to look like this. In fact, that's why a lot of us live here. But unfortunately, it doesn't look like that all that often. But in order to get it to do so, what we need to do as citizens is we need to work to oppose the inland port. We need to work for a livable climate. We need to oppose pesticide spraying by the Salt Lake City Mosquito Abatement District because their pesticide spraying is a dissemination of toxic chemicals throughout the valley, but also an additional source of ozone. We need to stop projects that will further drain the Great Salt Lake. So in order to do that, I encourage you to, in addition to joining your wonderful group, You can join many environmental groups here in Utah. You can join our group. You don't have to be a physician to do so. You can join the Utah Rivers Council, the Center for Biological Diversity, HEAL, Sierra Club, or the Unitarian Church Environmental Ministry. They all appreciate donations, but they also appreciate volunteers who are willing to spend their time to work to make this place a better place to live. Thank you very much.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. I will start with, I am very grateful that you have a sense of humor and that you threw some humor in there, because the sight of that is, yeah, it's a little disheartening. Hopefully we can get someone to stop some of it and then take some of the initiative to fix that, right? Sorry, I'm trying to read the chat real quick and see if there is any, if we have questions. If you have questions, throw them out in the chat. And we can ask the doctor for his answers, but that was incredibly informative. Like I said, a little disheartening because seeing those two contrasts, I mean.
Let me add one thing that perhaps is a little bit optimistic. Many of you may recall a few years ago that Governor Herbert said he was going to sign the Las Vegas water grab. He had, in fact, his Division of Natural Resources chief go around the state telling him that he was going to sign off onto that. But if he had, the draining of the aquifers in the Great Basin, particularly in the state of Nevada, would have created a gigantic dust bowl in and of itself. But we mounted a phone banking campaign to Governor Herbert's office. After he'd been going around to the public stating he was going to do that for almost 2 years, for 2 weeks, we had people calling his office every single day, telling him, don't you dare sign the Las Vegas water grab. 2 weeks later, he reversed course. He didn't sign it. And by not signing it, we may have averted the biggest environmental disaster in the history of this state. So the public's input can make a difference.
Thank you for that. On that note, June Taylor asks, which legislators can we target for supporting the inland port?
Well, unfortunately, you know the drill. Virtually every Republican legislator is on board with this. Not all of them, but almost exclusively. The problem with our Democratic legislators is most of them have felt like this is a done deal and there's nothing they can do to stop it. We don't agree with that. We think that if the public really, really doesn't want this and they're determined to not let it happen, then in fact it can't happen. And here's the reason why. The businesses involved do not want their reputations dragged through the mud. And in fact, any business that is seen as being a contributor to what we think will be this massive new source of air pollution is not going to want the public relations fallout from that. So if the public really raises enough opposition, we feel we can actually stop it.
Okay. So basically, I would say, to reiterate, just reach out to your legislator for starters, but all of them, any of them, as much as we can, right? The more voices they hear, hopefully, the more change we can see. Melanie Stone's wondering, are there concerns about the algae blooms on Utah Lake and airborne particles?
Algae blooms would be a whole nother lecture. But yes, they can certainly put out toxic chemicals that are dangerous to anybody who is exposed.
Okay. And then just one follow-up from June. Which companies can we target or reach out to? The biggest company that is probably the linchpin for this whole project is Rio Tinto. And that's because they are the biggest landowner. We need to try and convince Rio Tinto to set their land aside as a conservation easement instead of trying to figure out another way to make money off the citizens of Salt Lake City. If we can convince Rio Tinto that that's their obligation to us, instead of trying to milk a few more $1 million of profit, then that's actually probably the most important thing in terms of trying to stop this. So aside from Rio Tinto, are there other businesses that are supporting the inland port? Are those names public? Is that something we can find?
Another is the Colmena Group, a developing company. And then there are other construction companies, and we're actually going to start trying to publicize any banks that make loans for these projects.
Okay. I'm going to ask one final one before we wrap up to move on to our next speaker. Joan would like to know, how much do the ozone levels in Salt Lake City impact other areas of the state, or Salt Lake County impact other areas of the state?
Well, the precursors of ozone can actually form the ozone itself hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from where they're emitted. For example, satellite data indicates that wildfires in Alaska can increase ground level ozone levels in areas as far away as Europe. In other words, half away around the globe. So the precursors of ozone can be emitted here locally, and the ozone can form here locally, but it can also form literally thousands of miles away. So the entire globe shares an atmosphere. Nobody lives in an isolated atmosphere. So we need to be good citizens in not contributing to the atmosphere's pollution, not just for our own health, but for the health of everyone else.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was very informational. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We are going to move on to Isaac Cheek. He is the River Policy Communication Coordinator for the Utah Rivers Council. He's going to speak to us a little about the water side of our atmosphere. So I'm going to let him start up. If you do have questions for him as he's speaking, or any follow-up questions for the doctor here, go ahead and put those into the chat, and I will get them to them after he speaks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just let me know if you can see my screen. I'm sharing it right now. Can everybody see it okay?
Yes, you're good.
Sweet. Okay. Okay, so thanks for having me today. It's great to be here. Before we get started, hold on, let me go ahead and adjust my screen real quick. Okay. Before we get started, I just want to ask everybody a question. And I just want you to keep this question in mind as I move through my presentation. How would you feel if Utah's leaders were prioritizing personal profit over water conservation? So I'm going to ask it one more time, and I just want you to really think about it for the rest of this presentation. How would you feel if Utah's leaders were prioritizing personal profit over water conservation? So just a quick introduction. My name is Isaac Cheek. I'm the River Policy Communication Coordinator at the Utah Rivers Council. We're a 501c3 based out of Sandy, Utah, that's been around for the last 25 years. Been at the forefront of water policy and river advocacy over that time. So this is a picture of Utah's past. And I want you to look at this picture, and I want you to notice a few things. So we've got some people recreating on the river. We've got a guy fishing. We've got a nice green crop, lush forests. The river's full of water. But most of all, the thing I want you to really notice is the mountains. When you take a look at the mountains are full of snow, not just at their peaks, but from the base upwards. And I want you to keep that image in your head for a second. So this is a picture of Utah's potential future after a few more years of this climate change mega drought. As you'll notice, there's a lot of things that look a lot different. The crops are empty. There's nobody recreating on the river's running dry, and the forests are on fire. But again, most importantly, the thing that I want you to notice is the mountains. That snowpack that in the last picture was covering the entire mountain, it's creeping up. And instead of it snowing in the mountains, it's raining. And that's really at the core of this climate change caused mega drought, are these decreasing snowpacks. You see, as climate change worsens, winter air temperatures rise. And that's kind of what you're seeing in these pictures here. Over the last century or so, especially in places in the arid Western United States, the winter air temperatures have risen close to 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's really important, because when the winter air temperatures rise, then we don't have precipitation doesn't always fall as snow, and that snow melts sooner. And unfortunately, our climate change woes don't end there. This is a graph of precipitation in Utah over the last few decades. If you look at this graph from left to right, it's basically showing how accumulation as a whole accumulates as the year goes on. And if you look at that black line, that's 2021. So you can see we're at the bottom of this range. We're trending really low for precipitation. And not only that, but we're starting to drop off. It's getting worse. This is one of the worst precipitation years on record. So this precipitation, this low precipitation, coupled with these warming air temperatures in the wintertime, it creates this toxic cocktail of these climate change mega droughts. And this is why. So this is a graph of Green River flows in Green River, Utah. The Green River is a tributary of the Colorado River, and it flows into the Colorado River and ultimately provides about 40% of the flows into Lake Powell every year. So it's a huge source of water in our state. And if you'll notice on this flow chart, the flows stay fairly consistent throughout the year, but between April and July, they really begin to spike. And the reason that they're spiking during those months is for the reasons I was talking about before. That snowpack is so important. It's so important that we get that snow in the wintertime and that it sticks, and that when it warms up in the springtime, that it all flows out and runs off and fills up our rivers. But when we have these rising air temperatures and less precipitation, this runoff season, it shifts backwards in the year and it gets smaller. So we're not having as much water flowing into our rivers, and that's how we end up in the sorts of predicaments like we're in right now. That's really the essence of this climate change drought that we're facing. So this begs the question, or wait, hold on, one more thing. So this is something that experts in the Colorado River Basin have been sounding the alarm about for years and years. So these are a few excerpts from back in 2017, a paper that was published that was actually recently updated, basically just talking about how in a few years we're going to be facing roughly 20 to 30% decreases in Colorado River flows. And this paper was just updated this past May, I believe, and it was confirmed that what we're facing right now because of climate change are 20% reductions in Colorado River flows. This is an issue we're seeing across the Colorado River Basin, in the Colorado River, but also all across rivers in the West. Climate change is really decreasing our river flows. So this begs the question, what is the state of Utah doing to adapt to this mega drought and to adapt to climate change? And unfortunately, the answer is not enough. So in this graph here, if you look at the bottom, it shows a variety of different cities in the arid United States, in the Western United States, as well as the US average. And on the left, you'll see it says gallons per capita per day. So this graph is basically showing the amount of water that each person uses every day on average. And it's incorporating both municipal water use and industrial water use. So you'll see Utah's cities nearly double the US average, and it does double the average in cities in other places in the West like Tucson and Phoenix. So the fact of the matter is Utah's got to start conserving water. We're facing this huge drought caused by climate change that doesn't really seem to be going away. And our only option is to start conserving water. Thankfully, as you can see here, we have plenty of space to do so. We just need to catch up to some of these other cities and states. Unfortunately, we're moving in the wrong direction right now. This graphic right here is showing our old water conservation goal. From 2000 to 2019, under Governor Gary Herbert, was at 1% water conservation per year. So back in 2019, the Utah Division of Water Resources slashed that goal in half. So now we're looking at our statewide water conservation goal at being 0.5% per year. So as this drought's gotten worse, rather than increasing our drought or increasing our water conservation plan, we've cut it in half. And I just want to put that in perspective a little bit. So this graphic right here, you'll look at some of the different conservation goals of other states. So you've got California at 25%, Los Angeles at 7.5%, all the way down to Phoenix at 2%. And that 2% water conservation goal looks pretty small. But when you think about the fact that it's 4 times that of Utah, it really makes us look pretty bad. And it really shows that we're moving in the wrong direction, and we're ultimately really behind the curve when it comes to water conservation. So you're probably asking the question, it's pretty obvious that we're facing a drought. The governor's talking about it. These water districts are talking about it. Everyone's telling you to water less. So why is our statewide water conservation goal so low? Why are we moving in the wrong direction when it's becoming pretty obvious that we need to start saving water? So I'm going to play this clip, and I'm hoping that it'll kind of provide some clarity as to why that is, and to some of the special interest politics that are kind of pulling the strings when it comes to our low conservation goals. And please feel free to call out if the audio on this isn't working. The audio is more important than the visual. So as long as you can hear it, it'd be okay.
Tonight at the salaries we're about to show you, especially if you're not happy with your water bill.
Yeah, KSL investigators analyzed a little-known network of water districts and found they pay some of the highest salaries in the state. So KSL investigator Deputy Janovic wants to know whether taxpayers are getting soaked.
Ryan Glover's nursery depends on a constant supply of clean water.
Watering is the most important part of a nursery.
But when it comes to the water bill, well, he's not sure how much the people providing his water
I would imagine,
earn.
Probably $150,000 a year would be my guess.
Not quite, Ryan. You're a little low. KSL investigators analyze compensation packages, which include benefits like health care and sometimes a car. We found the top 5 employees of Utah's water conservancy districts earn on average over $250,000 last year. Take Richard Bay, $273,000. Tage Flint, $272,000. Nathan Shawcroft, $260,000. And the list, it just keeps going.
Were you guys able to hear that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So those people that they just listed, those are the managers that run the wholesale water supply districts in Utah. So just like any business, they make more money when they sell more of their product. And in this case, their product is water. So basically, the more water that you use, the more water that they can sell to you, the more money that they make. And the more water that you conserve and the less water you use, the less money they make. So some of the most powerful water leaders in our state have a vested financial interest against water conservation. Sorry, this slide.
Tonight.
There we go. Okay, and this has manifested itself in this kind of scary way. So this right here is a list of bills. Those water managers in the state and their water districts, they make up one of the largest lobby groups in the state of Utah. And they've taken that lobbying power through visiting with legislators and hiring lobbyists to visit with legislators. They've taken that lobbying power to oppose these conservation bills at the Utah State House. So right here is a list of conservation bills, many of which Utah Rivers Council has been behind or supported. So we've got things from water conservation plans to secondary metering bills to leak detection bills to property tax relief bills, dating all the way back to the 90s. Each of the bills listed here, we have documented opposition by water districts and by their lobbyists. So each of these bills right here was killed by the Utah Water Lobby. And just to show you how substantial this is when it comes to how much water we could have saved had we passed those bills, URC put together this graphic. So we had some of our research team go and look at these bills and look at the other states that have implemented these bills and see how much water they've saved. And we added that up to see exactly how much water we could have saved had this water lobby not opposed the bills. And it ended up being pretty substantial. I also want to put out there that those bills on the last slide, those are the kind of bills that we would refer to as common sense water conservation legislation. They're bills that other states have had implemented for years. By not implementing them, we're very far behind the curve. And it's a pretty stark statistic. The wasted water in that reservoir graphic that I just showed you, the water that didn't get saved, is the equivalent of 5 years of the Salt Lake Valley's annual water use. So this opposition to conservation that we've been experiencing from these special interests in Utah, it's really manifested itself in a lot of wasted water. So needless to say, it's high time that we abandon the special interests in Utah and that we start telling our legislators that it's time to take water conservation seriously, because we can't afford another 2 decades of water conservation opposition. It's, as I mentioned before, this climate change mega drought is here to stay, and we really need to start adapting to it. So it's time to get real about conservation. But the question you probably have is, what can you do about that? And the number one thing, as Dr. Moench mentioned, contacting your legislators. This is really, really important, because right now, that's those special interests that I've been talking about. Those people are the ones providing legislators with information. They're the ones setting the agendas right now. And this is where upward pressure from the public becomes really, really important, because if we have citizens just calling their legislators and saying, hey, what are you doing about water conservation? Hey, what are you doing to address this drought? What bills are you supporting this session to address this drought? Then that puts pressure on them, and it shows them that citizens really care about it, because ultimately that's the most important opinion is that of the constituents. And there's no need to be an expert on water conservation to have those conversations. Like I said, it's just a matter of asking them, like, hey, what are you doing? What are you doing to support conservation? The same goes for the governor. The governor has the power to change this measly 0.5% water conservation goal and bump it back up to something more on par with at least some of the lowest other states, or other cities. So bumping that water conservation goal from 0.5% up to 2%. That's something that Utah Rivers Council has been behind for a few years. And that's a tangible thing for you to bring to the governor and ask him to do. It's really important. And then another one is writing a letter to the editor to educate the community. And this one's a little more daunting, but it's a really good way to start a conversation in your community and to get your voice and your narrative out there. And it's something that URC does quite a bit, and something that we're really, really eager to help people do. So if this is something that interests you, but you don't really know where to start, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'd love to help. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was conserving water in your own home, because this is a really good way to set an example in your community and to just do what you can. And one great way to do this, I'm not sure, maybe some of you have heard of our rain barrel program, but just getting your hands on a rain barrel, whether it's through URC or through some other company, and putting it outside in your yard so that you can save water and use that water to water your yard, to water your garden, to grow your own food. Those are all really good ways to get started in water conservation. Same goes for xeriscaping and for paying attention to your how much you're sprinkling and everything. So to conclude, I just wanted to put my contact info up here, just because, as I said, we're really, really eager to talk to members of the community. If you have questions about my presentation, or you want to just chat about water, or if you want some coaching on how to talk to your legislator, which I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with. But if you want some talking points for that, I'd love to chat about that. So feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. And thanks for having me today. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Isaac. That was very helpful. I know at least one person has asked if they can get slides from your presentation. So if you want to send those to me or to Robin, that would be fantastic, if you're able to do that.
Yeah, I can definitely do that. It's a pretty big file.
Sure.
So just let me know if you have any issues downloading it, but I'd love to share it for sure.
Fantastic. So a few questions in the chat for you. Are the water managers appointed, the ones that are making that big salary? Are they appointed? And if so, by whom?
Yeah, so they're typically, from the way I understand, I think it depends on the water district. It's like a hiring sort of thing. So it's a quasi-governmental organization. They're not democratically voted in. But if you want to apply pressure to the water districts, a lot of times their phone numbers and their emails are on the websites. You can go on there, you can go to their board meetings. A lot of them are streamed live. So if you're interested in kind of becoming more familiar with that quasi-governmental kind of small society of water districts, then by all means, become invested in that.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see. Okay, so one of the things that they were hoping to get from your slides was not only the bills, but also, do you have a list of the individuals or entities, special interest groups that have put money into lobbying against those bills?
Yeah, so one of the primary groups that have put the money against those bills are the 4 largest water districts in the state of Utah. So that's Central Utah Water District, Washington County Water District, Jordan Valley Water District, and Weber Basin Water District. So those are the main organizations that they're either going to the State House and lobbying themselves, or they're hiring lobbyists to do so. One thing I'll mention is that URC just came out with a formal complaint, I believe last week, about this issue. And if you're more curious about looking at the specific evidence and the documentation that I was talking about, then visiting our website and looking for that, or if you want to reach out to me and I can pass some of that information along as well. We can get into specifics more.
Fantastic. So another question, can we get farmers and ranchers on board with the water conservation bills, because it's felt that they're electing the GOP legislators outside of Salt Lake County who might be working against these bills?
Yeah, that's a really it's a really nuanced question, because in reality, a lot of water conservation, it is a conservative issue. When it comes to like things like property tax relief, it's the kind of issue that you would think you'd be able to get conservatives on board with. So that's something that our organization works on a lot, is talking to these people, because out of everyone in the state that's concerned about water, the farmers and ranchers are up there. I mean, that's their livelihood. So we're really working on nailing down communication with those sorts of people and kind of getting them in our corner and joining them in their corner. It's definitely a possibility, though.
Great, good. It's been asked, how do we push back on the idea that our water use calculation is different from other areas that use less water, making ours look worse than it really is? Apparently, they feel that this argument's used all the time.
So that argument is pretty prevalent in places like Washington County. So a lot of times that GPCD statistic that I had, the gallons per capita per day, people in Washington County, which Washington County is behind the Lake Powell pipeline, sometimes the water district in Washington County will push back on that number and saying it's a faulty statistic. The best way to refute that would be that nearly every other water district in the Western US uses this system to calculate water. So unless Washington County is willing to say, this is why every other water district is wrong and we're right, then that's not really a super strong argument. And it's kind of compounded by the fact that they're one of the highest water users in the US, and they're claiming that the way that we calculate water is the problem, not their high water use. So it's definitely a hard thing to refute sometimes, but using that example that most other water districts are doing it one way and you're the one doing it differently, that's a fairly good response.
Okay, excellent. One person felt that maybe using water barrels in Utah was not allowed. Is that still the case or no longer?
So that did used to be the case, but recently, a few years ago, I can't remember the name of the legislation that was passed. It is legal now. And it's an awesome way to conserve water. And that's why that's one of our main conservation programs is rain barrels. It's totally, until you pass a certain point of water savings that most residents are not going to surpass, it's free and it's legal. If you pass that point, it can still be legal. You just have to register it. But all of that stuff is on our website too, if you're interested in the kind of legal side of that.
Fantastic. So it looks like kind of the last one in the chat is for both of our speakers today regarding water. What role or good legislation at federal level, proposed or not yet? So do we have any good legislation out there that we should be kind of supporting or pushing? I think that's what we're looking for. Kale, if I'm wrong, go ahead and speak up.
Well, yeah, I'm just curious about, given that we've got Democrats in Congress that are moving a lot of important legislation, what the federal state relationship is. I know on the Colorado River, that's a big one with the compact, and our neighboring states reminding Utah that they have a different vision and a different reality check than our own state. But what's going on at the federal level?
So in terms of the Colorado River on the federal level, one of the biggest projects that's been causing interstate issues is the Lake Powell pipeline, because we have Republicans in Utah who are really behind it, and we have all politicians in other states who are just starkly opposed to it, because it's this trans-basin water transfer. And in terms of the federal level, one of the things that we've been keeping our eye on are those infrastructure bills that are being worked on. Just because at this point, Senator Romney is in a fairly close relationship with regards to those bills with President Biden. And we're just kind of trying to keep our eye on it to make sure that Lake Powell pipeline doesn't get slipped in there, and that if money does get put towards water, that it's put towards real permanent water conservation legislation. And that's, like I said, we've been kind of watchdogging on that because it hasn't gone through yet. A lot of it's speculation, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I just am more hopeful that maybe the vision and the conserve first is clearer at the national level. And water, as you know, in the West is never one state. It's multiple states dealing with limited resources. And I think the pipeline's a pipe dream. And last year when I ran, I got very familiar with that argument. So I hope we can help push some of the federal legislation that would be ahead, I think, of what our state legislature, and I'll defer to Liz and others about what they might be thinking.
Can I just add a thought here that we are concerned that some of this infrastructure that is being funded by the federal government may actually be perverted by the Utah legislature and used for fossil fuel infrastructure and for water projects like the Lake Powell pipeline.
Okay.
We're also concerned that it may be used to further the inland port. Somebody asked in the chat about will the Lake Powell pipeline help drain the Great Salt Lake? No, but there is great concern that the Bear River project, the most important inlet to the Great Salt Lake, would actually further drain the Great Salt Lake, drop the lake level another several feet. So we are very weary of the possibility of the federal government coming in with billions of dollars and having the Utah legislature actually use that against the interests of the citizens.
That's helpful to know.
Thank you.
I know we have a couple more questions in the chat, but we have gone over our time, and I am afraid, Deborah, that your question is a whole conversation of its own as far as Utah's plans on growth and additional water consumption. My fear is that we don't necessarily have plans on the future growth and water conservation, at least not sufficient ones. But I do think that's a whole discussion we can have that would take a lot more than we have right now. So we can look at doing something like that in the future. Thank you to both of our speakers. That was fantastic. Very, very helpful. Thank you. Robin, back to you.
Yeah, well, we have gone over our time, but I just think that was well worth it. Thank you, Dr. Mitch. Thank you, Isaac. I hope to see you out on the stream fishing one of these days. It's been a great program. I appreciate everybody that stayed on. We'll see you again on August 7th.